Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lynette Hoelter, who is an archivist and the Director of Instructional Resources at ICPSR. She has a great presentation for you today that will kind of round out our secondary data series. So without further ado, Lynette, take it away.
Thank you, Daria. And I think I recognize your names from last time, but just in case, I am not a formal presenter, so especially with a group this small, if there's something that I say that doesn't make sense, or you're like, hey, we already know all this. First of all, if you tell me that, then you can finish giving the presentation, because you probably will know more than I do at that point. But seriously, if you want me to go over something again, or if you have a question about something, just jump in and unmute yourself and ask. And last week, I forgot to tell people that they were welcome to play along, but I wanted to make sure to let you guys know that today. So I chose a sample data set to work with, but if you want to look at ICPSR's catalog and find a different data set to kind of go through some of the steps, that's totally fine. Or if you want to read your email or, whatever. We all multitask during these things. So what I thought I would talk about today is what makes ICPSR data different, for example, than data that you might find in an institutional repository or on GitHub or some of the other places that you might find data. And then we'll look at some of the first steps in evaluating a data set, and this kind of overlaps a little bit with what Daria said last week. But I think it's always a good review to kind of start right from the beginning. And then I'll talk about where to find that information, the different pieces of documentation that you have available to you. And then I'll talk a little bit about the first steps that you should do if you find a data set that looks useful, and how you should really think about approaching those data as you begin your analyses. And then I typically find that I evaluate data slightly differently if I'm going to use it in the classroom. So I just have a slide or two on that as well. And then I'll wrap up with some final tips. So you can find data just about anywhere these days. If you Google the word data and some term of interest to you, you will probably get a long list of results. But why would we encourage you to use a place like ICPSR? One, because it's job security for me, but no, just kidding. We really do have the mission of helping people use data both now and into the future. And the way that we do that is what we call curation or data processing. And we like to think of that as sort of our secret sauce. And so this little image actually links to a video. I'm not going to show it to you, but if you're interested, it's about a minute long. But when we get data in from a depositor, whether it's the federal government or an individual principal investigator or a department head who's cleaning out someone's office because they've retired and left boxes of things there, we do still get data in that format. It goes through a standardized process. So one of the first things that we look at is whether there are any disclosure risks in the data. So we don't want, we take very seriously the pledges that researchers make to respondents about how their data are going to be used and who's going to have access to it. So one of the first things that we do is look to make sure that there's no what we call direct identifiers. So no names, no driver's license numbers, no social security numbers, things like that in the data. And if we do find those, then we strip them off right away. We do a further disclosure risk review later on in the process to make sure that combinations of variables can't help identify an individual, or what we call indirect identifiers. So that's a process that goes throughout the work of curation, but it's sort of where we start. And then we also look at the data for any odd codes or variables that aren't explained. Sometimes we get data in that are really well documented. So the researcher who's depositing the data, maybe gives us a code book and a questionnaire, and they've kind of written up their decision points at each step in the research process. But often what we get is, oh, here's the data that I used for this project 5 years ago. I don't really remember what's all in here, but you guys can make sense of it. And so we do that in a number of different ways. We have approximately 50 trained professional curators. And so they go through and they look for unexplained things, codes that don't make sense. So if a variable is supposed to have, 1 through 4 in its code and it has an 847, they're going to try to figure out why. They will also add what we call metadata, or information about the data. And this helps both, helps you to find it. So some of the metadata that gets added are like the subject terms and the geography description. It also helps you evaluate the data. So that's where they put the sample information and any information about who might be excluded from the data. All of the kinds of things you're going to want to know as you're looking at the data to decide if they will work for you. I feel like I was going to say something else about the metadata, but it just escaped my head. So, in creating that metadata, they will, the curators actually will work in concert with the principal investigator or data depositor if that person is around and available. And so if they find an odd variable or something like that, they'll go back to that person and say, hey, can you tell us what this means? Or we found this code in the data and it doesn't look right. Do you know what it means? Or can you give us a little bit more information about the sample? And if that person is not available or doesn't respond or whatever, they'll also look for any publications that are based on the data to see if they have a fuller description, for example, of how the data were collected or from whom. So they use all those sources to create the metadata that will allow you to find and evaluate the data. And then they output it in the file formats for the traditional stat packages. So I think I mentioned last week our current product suite is R, SAS, SPSS, Stata, and a comma separated version of the data. Yeah, I think that's all of them. I usually say them in popularity order, not alphabetical order, so I had to worry about forgetting one. Anyway, we also generate a standardized ICPSR codebook, which I'll show you in a little bit. And then if there is any other kind of documentation that's either needed, we might create it or work with the depositor to create it. Or if they give it to us, we'll make it available. And then in some cases, the data also are equipped with online analysis capabilities, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So I thought the best way to go through this might be to think about a sample research question, rather than just kind of thinking about this as a theoretical kind of discussion. And so I actually worked backwards. I found a data set that I thought would be interesting to, I know that most of the people who were on the call last week were interested in some aspect of health or healthcare. So I found a data set that includes both behaviors and attitudes. And so I was thinking, okay, what could we do with these data? And so the simple research question I came up with is, which of the following are related to feelings about societal health issues? So age, race, education, individuals' own health, and their insurance status. And Daria mentioned last week the kinds of things that you want to think about as you're searching for data. So I included those here. There are no specific time or geography limits. I'm just interested in exploring this topic kind of generally. I want individuals because I want to know how their own health affects their thoughts about healthcare access and things like air quality and nutritious food for other people in the society. So we also need to have those kinds of questions about societal health. We need to have questions about health insurance, the individual's health, and then the basic demographics. I would also encourage you, as you're looking for data for a research project, to think about the logistics. So are you doing this because you have is there a deadline that's encouraging you to start this project now? So are you building background for a grant proposal, for example, and wanting to give sort of a lay of the land where things stand today before you present what you could do to study them in the future? Or are you trying to submit something for a conference presentation? Are you working with a student who has a paper due in the next day or two? Not that any students would do that. But just kind of think about the time you have to work with the data, and then look at the data and see whether they're restricted, because that always adds about, we like to say about 2 to 4 weeks to the process. It's usually a little bit quicker than that, but we don't want to promise something that we can't deliver. So if you're working on a semester-long project, particularly with students, if you can find public use data, that would be fantastic. That's your ideal. Will the data take work? And we'll talk a little bit about what that means later on. But sort of how messy are the data? How much curation did we do on our end? Because we have different levels of curation, because as you might imagine, there's tensions between how much it costs to curate a study, how fast we can get data out, and the quality of the data itself. So we can't spend a year curating every possible study. So there are going to be some that have a little bit more work for you as a researcher to do. You might also think about your focal concepts. Do you have, are they all measured? Do you have a data set that has a really good measure of one of them, but not some of the others? And if the measurement of that concept is unique and something that's of interest to you, is there a way that you can change your research questions so that you can use those data and take advantage of that unique measurement? And then the last thing is something that we don't often think or talk about, but are the data heavily used? So I put this on there because I was thinking about the chance of being scooped. So I used a big secondary data set for my master's thesis, did a project that at the time nobody had done. By the time I went to publish it, an article doing almost exactly the same thing had just come out. So it was one of the big National Survey of Families and Households. So it was being used by researchers all over, and I should not have been surprised that I got scooped. But sometimes if you find a lesser known data set, the chance of that happening is going to be less. So I found this data set, the American Health Values Survey. And if you want to play along, if you're on icpsr.org, you can just search for 37403 and this study should pop up. So it does have a red bar on, which is always your first clue that, oh wait, some of these data might be restricted. And in some cases it'll have the red bar, and we're working on getting this note about public use data files to go away if there aren't actually any public use data files. But right now you may find a study that looks promising. It says that some are restricted, but that the public use data files are available. But then you go to look at it and there are actually no public use data files. So that's a little bit misleading. But the red line is always your cue to take a look at what it says in the data and documentation tab about what's restricted and what's public use. So Daria talked last week about a number of the tools that can be used to decide if these data will work for you. In our case, for the research question about demographic characteristics and individual level characteristics that might be related to people's attitudes about societal health. So we can use the search and the facets to look at if we want collection method or time period, time method, things like that. We'll look at the study homepage together, but that's really where you're going to get the meat of the information about the study that will help you decide if it will work for you. The codebook is something that you can look at it before you download the data, or you can look at it once you have the data. When you download the data, you get a copy of the codebook, whether you ask us for it or not. So that's sort of your standing documentation to help you use the data. And then also, we've got about 1,400 studies that have online analysis capabilities, and people find that really helpful for exploring the data before they decide whether to download them. So let's look a little bit closer at this study homepage, and it won't all fit on a single slide. So I broke it up, and as you scroll down, you'll see that there are heading lines, and those actually open up. They'll accordion fold so that you can see the rest of the information. But the first thing that you would do is take a look at the summary. And in this case, it looks like it'll work for our research question, probably because I made the research question fit these data, but it's all good. You might look at the subject terms, because if you decide that this data set isn't the exact one for you, you might find a subject term that you think fits the data and fits your interest, and you can see what else has been tagged with that subject term. You can look at the time period and the date of data collection. So if you need something that was collected in the last 10 years, for example, you want to look at the time period and date of data collection to let you know that you found data that will meet that requirement. There's also the sample and the information about how the data were collected is actually further down. This one is multi-method, phone survey, web survey, and maybe one or two other, but it's also cross-sectional. So that tells you if you were trying to look at trends over time, you probably couldn't do it with these data, or at least not these data by themselves. This data collection effort actually also has its own website. And so we try to put that somewhere in the information about it. Here it's buried in the data collection notes. That's why I wanted to put a special arrow to kind of point to it. Sometimes it's in the description or the summary, but just kind of look around on the page and see if there is a website for the project itself. We will always point you to that. Then you want to take a look at, okay, the data look like they'll probably work for my question. So let's look at them a little bit further. Let's look at what variables are in the data set. And this is that variables tab still on the study homepage. And the default is that it lists the variables in order by the variable name, which is not super helpful all the time. I almost always flip it to the order that they are in the data set, because the order they appear in the data set often follows the order they're in the questionnaire. So you can look for the chunk, for example, of demographic variables, or the chunk of variables about one's individual health. But if you click on the variable name, so here it's VAL1, if you click on that, you get a frequency distribution that shows you, okay, it looks like the question is about things that will make people happy. Where do you put having an important and having a happy and loving family? Most people say that it's extremely important. There's a little bit of variability, but not a ton. So if this was going to be one of my focal questions, I might think about either using it as a people who say it's extremely important compared to everybody else, or trying to find a different data set because you don't have a ton of variability there. But it also shows you on the left-hand side where this question falls in the survey document, because sometimes it's important to know kind of what the context is. So people answer questions differently depending on question ordering. For example, if you ask them about their overall health and then ask them about different ailments, they will answer that overall health question differently than if you ask them about specific ailments and then ask them the overall health. So sometimes just understanding that is helpful. Daria mentioned last week the publications tab. So in this case, there were 7 publications that were associated with these data. If we have if there's a PDF of that document, we link that right to the citation. Otherwise, we send you to where it might be in full text, and it uses your, so it would use Western Michigan's link resolvers to determine which subscription services your library has access to, and then it would just pop up the articles in those subscription services. So this one has a sort of an overall report from the data collection. I highlighted that one just to show you that we don't include only publications in refereed journals. If we find reports like this one, in this case, this was probably deposited with the data, but also book chapters or presentations, anything that we find, we will point you to. Any questions about any of that so far? Okay. So I mentioned that there's also online analysis for about 1,400 of our studies. You can get to that right from the that bar across just above the tabs that we were just looking at. And when you click Analyze Online, you actually get 3 different options. We're not going to worry about the 3 different options for now. Hopefully soonish, like by the end of this calendar year, maybe, there should only be 2. But the thing to notice is that 2 of them do frequencies and crosstabs, and 1 does full analysis, has full analysis capabilities. And I'll kind of show you what that is. But for now, we'll look at the frequencies and crosstabs. Because when you're evaluating data, what you're really wanting to know is, do you have enough people to do the kind of comparisons that you might want? So this is what that middle option will pop up. It brings up the variable list on the side. If you start typing a word in the boxes, it'll pop up anything that matches. So here I've decided for my research question, I probably want to look at both race, ethnicity, and insurance status. So I want to make sure that I have people who are insured and uninsured across all racial and ethnic categories. So to do that, I put those 2 variables in there, and then I clicked Build the Table, and it brings up a cross-tabulation table, which is essentially the 2 frequencies put together. So this shows me that by far most people are insured, but in most of the racial and ethnic categories, I do still have people who are not insured. So I should be able to compare. And this tells me that I might want to group some of these categories together because they are pretty small. When you're looking at a table like this to decide whether the data are right, you always want to look at the unweighted counts. The weighted counts can really kind of throw you off. So here you'll see the non-Hispanic Pacific Islanders, you've got 2 of them who were uninsured. If this was a weighted count, that might show in the thousands, and you would have no idea that your results were being driven by 2 people. So you wanna always look at the unweighted counts. This is that aside for full analytic capabilities. That was that first option. This is it's an ugly interface. We don't control it. It's called Survey Documentation and Analysis, and it comes out of the University of California at Berkeley. Some retired professors decided to write this package, set of tools, whatever you want to call it. And it looks like they wrote it in the 1980s and kept that design. There actually is a newer version that ICPSR needs to upgrade to that's slightly better, but still not beautiful. But anyway, this will allow you, it's a little bit hard to see, but across the top of the screen, you can see that there are buttons for analysis, and it'll do anything from those frequencies and crosstabs that we were just looking at up through different kinds of regression. So almost anything that you can do with a traditional statistical package, you can do with SDA. And this is particularly helpful if you're thinking about using it in the classroom. You can also create variables, so you can recode variables, you can create new variables within SDA. You can download subsets of the data. So if in looking at your cross-tabulation tables, you decide I want to narrow my question to only people between the ages of 30 and 55, you can use the online analysis capabilities to shrink that down. Obviously, you can also do it in your stat package once you download the data. So I've looked at these data and I've decided, yeah, there are enough people to look at the kinds of comparisons I want. They've got enough questions to answer my research questions, so I'm going to download the data. This download button right next to Analyze Online will give you the full full package. So if there were, this is a study that has only 3 things that you can download, which I think should pop up as the next thing. Yep. So there's the study level files, the public use data, and the restricted use data. The study level files are anything like a user guide or a code book that the principal investigator might have provided, or interview instructions or anything like that that applies across all the data sets. That's why we sort of call it study level files. Study level is usually just documentation, but not always. So on the download button, if this were a study that had, say, 42 different data sets, if you clicked download and then picked your statistical package of choice, you would get all 42 of those data sets in that statistical package. If that's what you want, perfect. If that's not what you want, you probably want to do it from the data and documentation tab. And here, this little drop down allows you to say, okay, for the public use data, give me, the one I used for my example is SPSS, but hey, look, there's also some qualitative data here. Maybe I should download that too. When you do the download, Daria mentioned last week, you'll have to log in using your My Data account, and then agree to ICPSR's terms of use, which basically say you won't share the data, you won't try to identify people, things like that. But once you do those things and you click that download button, you'll get a zipped file that includes, in this case, the study level file, which is a PI provided codebook, some workshop documentation, and then this top line report that I have a picture of that's just kind of key findings. In the standard ICPSR download, you'll always get a copy of that study homepage that we were looking at that gives you information about the sample and the time period and all that. You get a PDF of that page. You get a copy of the terms of use, since you probably didn't read them super carefully when you agreed to them before you downloaded the data. We want to make sure you have them just so you know what you agreed to. We give you the list of bibliography entries that were based on those data. And then we also give you the citation. I think I mentioned last week that it's really a good idea to cite the data, and we try to make it as easy as possible. For the public use data, in this case, I also got a ready-to-go data file and a standardized codebook. So each of ICPSR's studies goes through, as part of that curation process, the creation of a standardized codebook, which I'll show you in a minute. And then this one had that qualitative data. So I downloaded that too. So once you get the data, you really want to get in there and play. You want to start working with, start thinking about your research question. You want to start doing some analyses. But you probably should take a step back first. So we always encourage people to read the documentation. So in this case, there's the user guide. That's what is displayed here. So it gives you, this is from the principal investigator, so it tells you what the data are about, why they were collected, how they're different than some of the other data collection efforts in the health arena. And then it also gives you information about using survey weights. In this case, they did some oversampling for different groups. And so it talks about what the weights are and how they should be used. So it's always good to have an understanding of that kind of information that's either from the user guide or the front of the codebook. So this is one of the ICPSR standardized codebooks. The first page often talks about if there was anything that we did to help minimize disclosure risk. So here we masked a variable and we also took out the zip code. So we try to be transparent about any changes that we made to the data. This one describes the qualitative data file. It tells you some of the limitations if you're using these data in SPSS, and then also talks about some other things that the curator noticed as they were working with the data. And finally, the reason that you most want the codebook is that it gives you that list of all the variables that are in the data and their frequencies. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So also in that download package, you get what we call the ready-to-go files. These are files that you should be able to double click, and if you have the software installed on your machine, or if you're working on a campus machine that has it, they should open right up. And thankfully, that was the case in this case. So this is just a screenshot of what the data look like. In SPSS, they would look the same in just about any stat package. I just picked SPSS because it's our most common download format still. And you can see the data in the first part of that slide, and then also the variable view in the second part. And one of the things that's nice is you can see all the variable labels and the value labels as well. So you can click out those boxes and see what they mean. And you're still in that, I really want to start playing with the data. My research question is burning a hole in my pocket. I need to get to working on these data. So it's really tempting to skip this next step, but please don't. One of the things that we encourage people to do is just to really get to know their data. So just like you should have spent a little bit of time in the documentation, do things like running frequencies on all your key variables. You want to, in order to do that, or as a result of doing that, you can see, do you get what's in the codebook? Because maybe there's a weight that you didn't turn on that was on in the variables in the codebook, something like that. Or did you accidentally get rid of some of your cases? Did you do a save as where you deleted some of your cases? You also want to look at, does the order of the categories make sense? So if they're something that should go sort of from low to high on something, do they do that? Are the labels complete? This might seem less important as you're first beginning to look at the data, but think about yourself 2 or 3 months down the line, when you've done a bunch of other intervening things and you're coming back to these data because the journal that you want to publish them in asked for a couple revisions, you want to make sure that you still remember what everything is. So making sure that your labels are complete is a good way to do that. As you're looking at the frequency distributions, you might find that, for example, the race and ethnicity had some of those categories that were pretty small. I might look at that and say, do I really need those to be separate, or can I combine them? And then you also want to look at whether the missing values are labeled and defined. So in the screenshot, you can see that there are actually 4 different missing values for these data, and we have defined them. Otherwise, they would just show up as, you wouldn't see this little missing designation down here, and they would just show up in the list with the other ones. If they show up in that list, it means they're going to be included in your analyses, and you probably don't want that. So you want to make sure that they are labeled and defined. And then also, are there any skip patterns that you should be aware of? Do people get, some data collection efforts do experiments within the survey questionnaire. So do people get different versions of the questions? Things like that. Again, continuing some of that tedious work. I would encourage you to, if there are any variables as you are looking at your frequencies where the ordering didn't really make sense to you, a good practice is always to have the higher numbers on your variable, or the higher codes mean more of whatever is being measured. So does it work that way for the variables? And if not, do you need to switch the label of the variable itself, or do you want to switch the order of the categories? So things to think about there. Good survey practice suggests that if you're asking people a series of questions about a related topic, that you flip some of the questions around. Otherwise, you'll get people just sort of going down and doing agree, 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 agree. So you kind of want to make sure that people are reading the questions. But before you use those for analyses, then you need to flip them back. So as you're doing your frequencies, look at that. Are there any things that you want to use in a scale that are in the opposite order of all the other questions? We talked about looking at categories that might be collapsed, and again, always the unweighted. And then think about any new variables that you might want. Here they asked lots of different variables about kinds of societal health. You might want to put those together into a scale. You might want dummy variables to include in a multiple regression. That's a way of being able to include categorical variables in as your predictors. Or computing new variables. If you have, for example, both parents' education, and you want to make sure that you capture whoever's is highest because you want only one value for each respondent, think about if you're combining, do a statement that compares the two and chooses the highest, or if only one exists, it uses that one. So what kind of variables do you want to create? And it looks like I cut and pasted and put the same thing at the top of the next slide, which I remember that I did after I started talking about that. And here I just listed the different kinds of scales that you might want to do, and gave the example that I just gave you. You want to think about if there are any weights included with the data. Most of the large national data collection efforts now require the use of weights. But you also want to think about, does your particular research question require you to use weights? Are you trying to look at something that you could generalize to the overall population, or are you just doing something that's descriptive of the people who answered that survey? Thinking about those kind of things. And then if there are multiple weights, which ones do you need to use? If you're looking at data that are longitudinal or repeated cross-sectional, you might need to merge some of those files together. So if it's longitudinal or panel data, we should have included an ID that will allow you to match the same respondent across waves. So you're adding variables or making the file longer. If you're looking at repeated cross-sections, so the same questions asked of different people at different time points, and you want to put those together, just make sure that your variables are named properly so that you don't overwrite some variables, and in that case you're actually going to be adding cases to the bottom of the file. So thinking about those kind of things if that's something that your research question requires. And then, oh yeah, wait, I said that these data also had qualitative data. In this case, the term qualitative can be a little bit misleading, but what it often means is that if there are open-ended questions in the data, we often give them to you in a CSV file. So we retain the detail. We don't put it in the data set in any way, but you can see that you do get the ID. So if you decided that these were really important to your research question and you wanted to code them, you could do that and match the code back to the respondents in the data file. That's all about using data for your own research, but if you're using it in class, I find that the order of things that I think about differs just a little bit. So the first thing I ask myself is, do I need online analysis? Do I want my students to be able to do this without me having to teach them Stata or SPSS or even Excel? Or are my students, is it still COVID? Are they still distanced and not wanting to, connect to the main university computers? Using online analysis there is, again, going to be the right answer. Are you looking for specific topical content? When I'm teaching research methods or statistics, that's often a much lower consideration than if I were looking at data for a research project, for example. I don't care necessarily about the specific content, but I usually look for something that would be interesting to the students and is relatively recent. Are you looking for data that are linked to a particularly interesting article or summary report? If you're just introducing students to working with data, having a summary report for them to read is a good bridge between not thinking about data at all and then reading a journal article. So the summary reports tend to be in a little bit less jargon, and they tend to use basic descriptive statistics, things that are all easier for students to grasp hold of. And then for me, the logistical considerations are really big if I'm going to use the data in class. So thinking about both, what am I trying to teach? Do I have enough cases or enough variables to make sure that I can demonstrate everything I want to with this particular data set? So can students do comparisons if I'm teaching difference between mean tests, things like that? Are there interval ratio data variables in there so I can have students work with those? Or can I create scales from the variables that are in there that could be interval ratio? And then thinking about whether the missing values are already declared. If they're not, that's going to take you time to go through and do it and make sure that you don't miss anything. Is the question text present, or are the variable and value labels descriptive enough? Particularly if you're just going to use the results tables, either in your lecture notes or I often use results on an exam and then have students interpret them. But if you're only going to be using those tables, will they have enough information to be able to do what you want them to do with it? And then how much sort of fiddling or that boring but useful stuff that I talked about for research data, how much of that is required in the data that you're looking at? And do you have time to do it? So final tips, read the documentation. It's always a good idea. When you're looking at data to decide whether you want to use them, or you're looking at your variables and thinking about collapsing categories, make sure you're always looking at the unweighted counts. And often in journal articles, for example, the demographic tables are presented in unweighted counts. So that's just kind of a good reminder. Don't skip the less exciting stuff. Make sure that you actually know your data. Ensure that your variables are well labeled and that you comment your code. There's a project actually that focuses on teaching undergrads about replicability and transparency in research. And they actually have come up with a system for labeling things and putting specific pieces of their analysis in separate folders, all because they realized that very few people could actually replicate work that was in journals, even when they had done that work themselves. So making sure that you give yourself as many cues as you can possibly do will help you to go back and look at it and hopefully help you or someone else replicate what you did. The thing that nobody ever believes is that everything will take more time than you think. It seems like an easy thing to download some data, come up with a research question and run your analyses, but chances are you're going to find something that's you either need to think about more longer, or you need to define your missing values, or whatever it is. It's going to take more time. And then just another plug, when you publish, cite the data. And if you're required to do so, or if you just want to follow good scientific practice, share your reproduction data set. And that is it. So any questions? I sort of flew through that. And I was not paying attention to the chat at all.
Thank you so much, Lynette. That was great. And we're obviously here to take questions. Before we do that, I do want to share a feedback form in chat, and also a link to the slides if that is something that you are hoping to look at later on your own. We encourage that you do so. We also have an open session next week at noon, where Lynette and I will hang around for an hour, and we encourage you to bring your secondary data questions. Pretty much, you know, if you're trying to find something in ICPSR, or have any questions about how to find data for your specific research question, or just want to get familiar and do some hands-on learning, we encourage you to participate in that. That's next week at noon, the same link. But yeah, other than that, thank you so much for coming, and we will stick around and are here to answer any questions that you may have.